Hello everybody, welcome again to Black Cat Theology. This is Dr. Peter Dillard and this is the 11th installment of our video lecture series. Last time we were examining a problem with the phenomenology of the holy set forth by the Marburg theologian Rudolf Ott. And the reason that we were looking at Ott's phenomenology of the holy initially is that it promises to offer a very useful tool to the project of developing a Gelassenheit theologian within this broad Heideggerian framework that I have been setting forth in these lectures. Now let's remind ourselves first of what the basic structure of Otto's phenomenology is, and then of the problem with it. Let's review that briefly, and then what I want to do in this video lecture series and the next two is look at some philosophical tools that might help us to overcome this problem. So let's remember the very basic character of Otto's theology or phenomenology of the holy. So basically there is a phenomenon of the holy, this sort of undifferentiated experience or phenomenon of the holy. And when Otto is thinking about this, he brings to bear on this phenomenon some very basic Husserlian notions that we also encountered a couple of times ago. And so let's remind ourselves of what those are. The idea is that within this phenomenon of the holy, this overall phenomenon, there are two poles. One pole is the numinous pole, and the other pole is the noumen. Now, the numinous pole corresponds to Husserl's notion of noesis. And so these would be our particular feelings, our emotions, our beliefs, our judgments, whatever, these mental states that we might have that are part of the phenomenon of the holy. And then the other pole, the opposite pole of this overall phenomenon is what Otto calls the noumen, and this corresponds to Husserl's notion of the noema. That is the intentional object of the experiences, of the noetic experiences or of the numinous experiences. So in the case of the overall phenomenon of the holy, the noumen, or as Husserl would put it, the noema, the intentional object of that experience, what those numinous experiences purport to be about is something that transcends us, is non-human, is divine, is a holy, mysterious presence. So those are the basic Husserlian notions that Otto adapts to his own purposes in this phenomenology of the holy. Now, what was the problem with this phenomenology? Well, the problem was quite straightforward, and that is, recall when we go into a little bit more detail about Otto's phenomenology, he says that the noumen, the intentional object of the numinous experiences that are part of the phenomenon of the holy, the noumen has two main characteristics. This one is the mysterium tremendum. This is the way in which the holy noumen appears to us as something awe-inspiring, something mighty, something a little bit terrible. And corresponding to that are our feelings in the face of this inspiring and mighty and somewhat frightening thing. And those are experiences of awe, fear, and just being taken aback. The second noumenal attribute, or the second feature that Otto attributes or ascribes to the holy noumen, is what he calls mysterium fascinans. And this is a more positive aspect under which the holy object or the holy noumen appears to us. That is the aspect of something that's desirable, it's wonderful, something that would be wonderful to be united with. And so corresponding to that noumenal attribute are our numinous experiences of desire or longing or yearning to be united with the holy noumen that appears to us under the aspect of something that is intensely desirable. Now, the problem here, recall, is that Otto does not explain why it is exactly there is only one holy noumen or one intentional object of numinous experience that has these two noumenal attributes, mysterium tremendum and mysterium fascinans, as opposed to there being two holy intentional objects or two holy noumena, each one having one of those two attributes that I just adumbrated. And so Otto doesn't really rule out the possibility of there being, instead of just one holy or one God, two holies or two gods. That would be inconsistent certainly with any kind of orthodox theism, and in particular with the Christian orthodoxy that we are seeking to develop theologically here. So that was the problem with Otto's view that we encountered. We called it an ontological antinomy. Now, what I want to do beginning today and in the course of the next 2 lectures is turn to some tools, some philosophical tools that might help us deconstruct or overcome or alleviate that problem. Where should we look? Well, remember the last time we noted very briefly, we noted that Otto has a non-genealogical account of the holy. He doesn't see our experience of the holy noumen and the various numinous experiences that are directed at that intentional object. He doesn't see that overall phenomenon as evolving from more primitive non-religious phenomena. He thinks that the religious phenomenon of the holy, taken all together, is sui generis. It's something autonomous, let's put it that way. Now, that provided us a helpful clue because we saw that Wittgenstein, in some of the things that he says about the sinister, when he's discussing the views of James Frazer in Wittgenstein's notes called Remarks on Frazer's Golden Bough, Wittgenstein also wants to say that this notion of the sinister is not something, for example, the sinister character of the Belltown Fire Festival where people in latter-day times feign to sacrifice another human being by burning that person alive. That ceremony has a certain sinister character. And we feel that when we think about it or when we watch it. And Wittgenstein wants to say that the sinister character of that festival and related phenomena, eerie phenomena, which he groups together under the rubric of the sinister, that doesn't derive from the fact that the ritual, the latter-day ritual, is derived ultimately, historically, can be traced back to some actual practice of human sacrifice by fire. Wittgenstein thinks that the sinister character of that is in an important sense autonomous. Now, in our next lecture, I want to come back to that particular issue, that discussion in Wittgenstein of the sinister. But today, I want to start somewhere else in Wittgenstein's philosophy, and specifically in his later philosophy. What we need, it seems to me, it strikes me, that what we need in order to deconstruct or overcome this ontological antinomy that we find in Otto is some way of thinking about the holy as the object of the holy noumen, the intentional object of our numinous experiences. We need to think of it not so much as a being or as a particular thing that's picked out or an object. I use that term object in a very broad sense, but we want to be careful not to read too much metaphysical content into that. What we want to try to say, I believe, is that the holy noumen is real, but it isn't a kind of a particular object, it isn't a particular being, nor is it, as we have seen earlier in some of our lectures, is it being itself, whether that's understood metaphysically or non-metaphysically, yet it is real. Now this is a kind of paradoxical thought, I realize. We might want to think of it as objectivity without objecthood, or objectivity without objects. We want to say that there can be things that are real, something that's real, without being a particular object or a particular thing or an entity that we can point to and say, aha, there it is. And so the idea is that if we can give a philosophical picture of that, which also then enables us to explain why all the numinous experiences we have, whether they are numinous experiences of being overawed or somewhat frightened on the one hand, or they are numinous experiences of great longing and desire to be united with something, how they all converge on one something that's real, at least purports to be real, without being some specific object. So again, the idea that the objective here is to explicate some notion of objectivity without objects that we can begin to develop by looking at some examples from Wittgenstein with an eye to resolving this ontological antinomy that we have in Rudolf Otto's Phenomenology of the Holy. Now, today what I want to do is focus on Wittgenstein's discussion of pain in philosophical investigations. And I want to make it clear that I am not going to try to discuss every particular nuance or detail of Wittgenstein's view. It's a very complicated view. There are a lot of questions that we could ask, and that's okay. But what I want to do is to try to convey the basic character or idea that the way that Wittgenstein is approaching this issue. So the most important thing to remember at the outset is that Wittgenstein in the investigations does not want to deny that there's such a thing as pain. We do experience pain. That is something that is, we have experiences that purport to be experiences of pain. We are in pain. It's something real. But Wittgenstein wants to move against or militate against a certain philosophical picture, which is that when I have pain, or when you have pain, when somebody else has pain, that person's pain or my pain, in each case, is a private object that is accessible only to the person who is experiencing the pain, and that explains why that person is in a privileged position to report on the fact that he or she is in pain. Now, Wittgenstein's approach here, as I understand it, is to work against this picture in a sort of piecemeal way by telling certain philosophical parables that remind us of how we use the expressions ordinarily that here are being employed to try to flesh out or draw, if you will, this picture of pain as essentially private objects. And Wittgenstein's objective here, his goal, is to say, well, once we get clear about the linguistic practices and the everyday contexts in which we use these words, we begin to lose our grip upon the idea that pain is essentially some kind of private object. Each person's pain is essentially some kind of private object that only he or she has access to, and that therefore only he or she can report on. Now, let's look at three such parables. The first one is the famous beetle in the box example that Wittgenstein gives in the investigations. And I don't have the particular passage or section number in front of me, but you can look this up in an edition of the investigations in the index. And so Wittgenstein says the following. He says, suppose everyone had a box with something in it. We call it a beetle. No one can look into anyone else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. Here it would be quite possible for everyone to have something different in his box. One might even imagine such a thing constantly changing. But suppose the word beetle had a use in these people's language. If so, it would not be used as the name of a thing. The thing in the box has no place in the language game at all, not even as a something, for the box might be empty. No, one can divide through by the thing in the box. It cancels out whatever it is. So here I take Wittgenstein to be stating sort of the general idea that he wants to work towards in his discussion of pain. And that is that what the reality of pain is not, we don't understand what it is for pain to be real by having some picture of some private something in us. Because when we look at how we actually describe pain, cope with pain, deal with pain, something I want to come back to in more detail in just a little bit, when we look at that, we see there really isn't any notion of a private object that's figuring there. Everything is out in the open, or yes, there are things going on in our brains, and there are things that are going on in the central nervous system, but what really gives us a grip on pain as something real are these common shared practices of reporting pain, describing pain, coping with pain, maybe treating it, and so forth. So not essentially private objects, not an object that only I can have access to, or that you can only have access to when you happen to be in pain, or I only have access to my pain when I'm in pain. Now, that's simply a kind of schematic view of what Wittgenstein's trying to accomplish here. But somebody might persist, say, well, wait a minute, though, what explains why I am in a privileged position to report on my pain, whereas you're not? Or you're in a privilege, if you have a pain, a headache, or a toothache, or something like that, you are in a privileged position to say whether or not you are in pain, and what kind of pain it is, and how much it hurts, and so forth, and not I. What explains that, except that there is some kind of private sense datum in each case, painful sense datum, or essentially private pain sensation, and that I have mine, to which only I have access to, and you have yours to which only you have access. Now, here Wittgenstein tells another parable that I think is helpful here. Or actually, it's not so much a parable from Wittgenstein. It's an example that comes from J.L. Austin in his great book Sense and Sensibilia. But I think that Wittgenstein would be very sympathetic to the way Austin would apply this to the example of pain. And so what we're trying to understand are the words, well, somebody has privileged access to something. Somebody can directly see it so that someone is in a better position to report on it. Those phrases, right? Privileged access to something, directly seeing it, and better position to report on it. What are the situations in which those words have a very clear meaning to us, a use that we all understand? And once we do that, when we try to put them all together or cobble them together in order to convey this idea, this notion of an essentially private object, the whole thing falls apart in our hands. So what is the example that Austin gives? Well, he talks about the fact that I cannot directly see the back of my own head. You cannot directly see the back of your own head. I could see the back of your head. You could see the back of my head, but I can't do that. So here we have something, let's just take my case. There is privileged access to the back of my head by directly looking at it on the part of somebody else. So there, the words having a privileged access to something, being able to see it directly and not in a mirror or something, those words have clear sense when we're thinking about you, for example, looking at the back of my head and telling me whether I have a tick there, or maybe I have a scar there, or maybe there's some pain or something there, and you're informing me of that. But then, obviously, it doesn't follow that the back of my head is an essentially private object, nor does it follow that I am in a better position to report on it, or that I have privileged access to it. You have some privileged access to it, and anybody else with normally functioning vision can look at the back of my head and see what's going on, but I don't. But they can still tell me what that is, and also the particular object in question, that is the back of my own head, that's not something essentially private at all. So here is a very specific example of where, using this example from Austin, I think, Wittgenstein's methodology or his approach here sort of begins to work at this picture and say, well, it really doesn't make sense, because here's an example where we can understand all those words, but when we try to extrapolate from that to some notion of an essentially private object, we fail, and so we're left empty-handed. Now, the interesting thing about Wittgenstein's methodology is that it's not cut and dried. I mean, it continues to go on. People might, for example, a philosopher or somebody who believes that pains are essentially private objects, that person might continue to insist that there are such things. And so she might say something like that, well, look, I certainly know what it's like for myself to be in pain. I know that. And so to suppose that somebody else has a pain, an essentially private pain that I can't get at, I sort of like by analogy. I know that, well, that person is in a kind of state, the same kind of state that I'm in when I'm in pain. And so since I know my own pain, I can then extrapolate to somebody else's pain, which I can't have any direct access to, which is an essentially private object. And the other person could do the same thing with me by extrapolating from her own experience of her own pain to me. Now, Wittgenstein finds this move of trying to extrapolate it, say, well, I know what it means for me to be in pain, where that's essentially private, and so I can kind of extrapolate that to somebody else. He uses this example of it's being 5 o'clock on the sun, and he said, well, look, that's like saying somebody knows, we all know what it's like to be 5 o'clock here on Earth, right? Let's say in the Pacific time zone or the Eastern time zone, wherever you may be. So what it is for it to be 5 o'clock on the sun is for it to be the same, just like it is when it is 5 o'clock here, except that that's on the sun. Now when you think about it, that doesn't really make any sense, because the things that enable us to understand what we mean when we say it's 5 o'clock here, like I'm staring at the hands on the grandfather clock around cocktail hour, or I'm looking at a digital readout on a computer when in the right portion of the afternoon, that surround, that context, those language games, this is a very important notion of Wittgenstein's, those language games enable us to make sense of the phrase, well, I know what it is to be 5 o'clock here. But none of that has any application on the sun. None of it. There are no grandfather clocks on the sun. There are no digital readouts or anything. Even if we were to fire some kind of a digital clock into the sun, into the heart of the sun, and then it somehow miraculously weren't destroyed, and at some point it said 5 o'clock, we could do this. We could also fire another one that's programmed slightly differently from a different part of the earth, and so if it's miraculously not destroyed, it might read out at the same time, well, as 12 o'clock, noon. And so we don't have any purchase of what it is for it to be 5 o'clock on the sun simply by looking at what it is for that to be the case here on Earth in various time zones and regions. Now, we might say, well, there's no fact about the sun in virtue of which it could be 5 o'clock there. It doesn't make any sense. Now, what I want to say about this is just let's go a little bit farther, and I think what Wittgenstein is really driving at here is that there's no fact about me that I could point to that would explain, so it's an essentially private fact, or that could, even if I just restrict my attention to myself, and I think this is really what's at the bottom of this 5 o'clock on the sun example. It has to be clear if I'm going to extrapolate from myself to somebody else. I have to understand what it is for me to be in contact with this painful private object that's essentially there. And Wittgenstein wants to say, well, that's not the case. And the reason it's not the case, he feels, is that we could think about, well, what would that be? He uses another example of, well, suppose that somebody is keeping a diary, and every time the person has a certain pain sensation, she writes down the mark S. Right? So every time she has that, she writes down the mark S. But is that what she's doing? Is she writing, in that case, is she using that inscription to describe the same pain sensation each time? Or is she using it each time to describe an entirely different sensation? Maybe that's what she's doing, is that she's just making up the use of this to describe whatever is going on in her, this use of the symbol S, to describe whatever happens to be going on in her at the time that she writes it down. And I think what's very odd about where Wittgenstein is onto something here is that we're supposed to imagine somebody sort of carefully writing this down, this S, over and over and over again, and almost like a child who's sort of very quiet in the corner doing this, and that doesn't look like pain at all. It may be that the person is suffering from pain and that is recording that every time it occurs, but it could just be that the child is using S willy-nilly to describe whatever is going on in her system, whether it's painful or not. And so the S symbol doesn't, or sign, doesn't pick out a particular private object. So once again, this has fallen apart in our hands. We don't really have any sense of it. Now, okay, so let's wind up for today by saying, well, or explaining a little bit more about, well, what is it for Wittgenstein, according to Wittgenstein? What is it for pain, us to understand what pain is? Because he does want to say that pain is something real. Well, here Wittgenstein's notion of grammar is very important. And he doesn't mean grammar in the sense of like what we learned in grade school or what Chomsky does when he's writing syntactic structures. He's talking about the way we use words in ordinary contexts in everyday life, and we need to look at a variety of those in connection with pain. So what are those? What is the grammar of pain? What are the everyday situations and contexts in which we cope with or deal with pain? So we can imagine somebody engaging in pain behavior. I might have a frozen shoulder or a very bad wince, and I might grab my arm and make certain kind of grimaces. And people who are sufficiently attentive and compassionate and concerned about me might respond by comforting me. I might go to a specialist, and the specialist might, prescribe a certain course of medication, and then I could, over time, maybe the shoulder loosens up, and I'm no longer grimacing. I'm no longer having those kinds of behavioral responses. So that's one thing that could happen. What's important, too, is that it's part of the grammar of pain that we can feign pain. We can pretend to be in pain when we're not. So imagine someone who claims to have whiplash and goes through all the motions and all the gestures and everything. And then, so the insurance agency gets very suspicious because the person files a claim. So the insurance agency sends an investigator to film this person's movements throughout the day surreptitiously to do this. And it turns out that the person one day is filmed under the car, looking under the car, repairing the car, and so obviously showing no signs of pain or anything like that. And so then this person is called on the carpet about it, and she might say, yes, I'm sorry, I was trying to engage in insurance fraud. I'm not really suffering any pain. So there can be times when people exhibit pain behavior, but they don't really have pain because they're feigning it. Alternatively, there can be cases where people are very stoic. They don't exhibit any kind of pain behavior, but they are in pain. So we might imagine someone who's very stoic, who's suffering but doesn't want to bother other people, and maybe even keeps a diary of this, or maybe doesn't say anything at all, but then one day, many years later or many weeks later, the person comes forward and says, I was really in a lot of pain there, and here's why, because I didn't want to disturb you, but it was very difficult for me. And we know the kind of situations in everyday life where something like that might unfold. And that's the key to understanding what Wittgenstein is trying to do here vis-a-vis pain. What it is for pain to be real, a real something, is not for pain to be some essentially private object in each person's case, which to each person and only to that person is accessible, and which that person can somehow directly inspect. What it is for pain to be real, our understanding of what it is to be real, is for people to participate in this rich variety of practices, this grammar of pain, which involves behavior, but also situations and language, and what Wittgenstein calls language games, that are embedded in a particular form of life. Our form of life, where we have the bodies that we do, although there could be conceivably organisms that have very different neurophysiological and physiological structures who experience pain. But if we couldn't make some contact to the grammar of pain as we know it, then we would lose our grip on what it is to say that they're in pain. So what's important here, just to wrap up for today, is that for the pain to be real, it's not simply reducing pain to behavior. It's not a kind of behaviorism about pain. It's the complex practices that we learn when we learn our language and we are inculcated into our culture, initiated into our cultural ways of life, which are common to many of them to all human beings. That's how we learn what pain is, by learning the grammar of pain, not by learning about private objects or particular mysterious beings that hide behind our behavior, hidden deep in the recesses of our own consciousnesses. That's not the way it works. So here we have an example of a kind of objectivity in connection with pain that doesn't treat pain as a certain kind of object or a set of objects. That's not how you understand pain. So this is one step toward the objective of providing Otto with a similar conception, a similar notion of the holy as objective without being a particular object or being, a particular being. This is one step towards that goal. Now, that's only the first step. We need to do a little more work here because, you do have your pain and I have my pain. In some sense, we know what that is because we can report on it. We can relate those things to the grammar of pain as I've just been describing. But there are different pains. Whereas Otto wants to say there's only one holy. And remember, that's our problem. The problem is to understand how there's only one intentional noumenal object of the numinous experiences that are part of the phenomenon of the holy. So next time, we're going to move in that direction a little bit further. I don't want to say anything more about that. That's all for today. The last thing I want to do very briefly is give an acknowledgement to one of my great teachers, Kathleen Emmett Bostedt. She was one of my teachers as an undergraduate who first introduced me to Wittgenstein's later writings, and I actually participated. I was very privileged to participate in a graduate level seminar, even though I was an undergraduate at the time, where we read both the works of Heidegger and the works of Wittgenstein. And so that really planted the seeds for the research that I have been able to do later. So I want to express my gratitude towards her. She is one of the best teachers. In fact, she is the greatest teacher that I've ever had. And I have a great deal of respect for her. So Kathy, if you're listening, thank you for helping me. These lectures are an outgrowth, to a large extent, of the seeds that you have planted. I wish everybody a good day. Please feel free to leave behind any questions that you may have, and we will continue our Wittgensteinian flavored analysis of objectivity without objects next time. Thank you very much.